The diagnosis came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Stage 3 breast cancer. Claire sat at their kitchen table watching steam rise from her untouched tea as Robert stood across the room, his body language betraying a distance that had nothing to do with the physical space between them. 8 years of marriage reduced to this chasm of silence. The ticking clock on the wall seemed to grow louder with each passing second, marking time that suddenly felt both precious and burdensome. She watched him carefully, noting how his eyes focused on the window, the floor, the ceiling, anywhere but her face. He hadn't spoken a word since the doctor called with the results. No reassurances about fighting this together, no gentle touch on her trembling hands. Just the rhythmic click of her spoon against porcelain as she stirred sugar that had long dissolved. The silence between them spoke volumes, and Claire felt a chill that had nothing to do with her condition. She had always prided herself on their connection, on knowing what Robert was thinking before he voiced it. But now, studying his rigid posture and averted gaze, she recognized something entirely new. Something that looked disturbingly like resentment. "Should we talk about treatment options?" she finally asked, her voice sounding foreign even to her own ears. Robert nodded mechanically and mumbled something about researching specialists, but his eyes remained fixed on his phone screen. In that moment, Claire realized she was facing two devastating diagnoses, the cancer growing inside her body and the quiet death of her marriage happening right before her eyes. The changes accelerated in the weeks that followed, becoming impossible to ignore or explain away. Robert began arriving home later each night, offering increasingly vague explanations about work demands and project deadlines. Their once comfortable routines disappeared one by one, like stars blinking out in a darkening sky. Where they once cooked dinner together, Claire now prepared meals that went cold waiting for him. Their evening walks, weekend brunches, morning coffee ritual, all vanished without discussion. She scheduled her first oncology appointments alone, sitting in waiting rooms surrounded by couples holding hands and supporting each other while her own fingers clutched empty air and crumpled tissues. The doctor spoke about treatment plans and success rates, but all she could think about was the emptiness beside her where Robert should have been. Her phone remained silent throughout these appointments, no checking in, no asking how it went. Back home, she moved through their house like a ghost, speaking to Robert's back as he absorbed himself in television shows or his laptop. "I'm starting chemotherapy next Tuesday," she said one evening as they occupied opposite ends of their living room sofa. He nodded without looking up from his phone, muttering something about trying to get time off. But when Tuesday came, he texted that a meeting had come up. Claire sat alone as poison dripped into her veins, fighting not just cancer cells but the crushing realization that the worst part of her illness wasn't the physical pain that had begun to manifest. It was being treated as if she were already gone. Claire found the evidence piece by piece, like assembling a puzzle she never wanted to complete. First came the credit card statement showing dinner for two at an expensive downtown restaurant on a night Robert claimed to be working late. Then a text message preview that flashed across his phone screen before he quickly pocketed it. "Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again." The final confirmation was the distinctive floral perfume that clung to his shirts, something youthful and sweet that Claire would never wear. She didn't confront him immediately. There was a strange, detached feeling as she collected these artifacts of betrayal, almost as if she were gathering evidence for a case that had already been decided. Her heart didn't dramatically shatter. It simply sank with the quiet resignation of confirming what she already suspected. One evening, she found a long blonde hair on his jacket. Claire's own hair was dark and increasingly thin from treatments. She twirled it around her finger, watching it catch the light. Cancer was ravaging her body from within, but somehow this single strand of evidence caused a pain that cut deeper than any physical symptom. She placed the hair on his pillow that night, a silent acknowledgement between them. When Robert saw it, he paused for just a moment before brushing it away without comment. That gesture told Claire everything she needed to know about how far they had fallen, about the woman who was waiting for him while his wife was fighting for her life. "I can't do this anymore," Robert said one Sunday morning, suitcases already lined up by the front door. Claire sat at the kitchen table, fingers wrapped around a mug of cold coffee. She'd sensed this moment approaching for weeks, had felt him emotionally packing his bags long before they materialized in physical form. "This isn't what I signed up for," he continued, voice measured as if rehearsed. "I need to live my life. This situation it's too much." He mentioned a woman named Jessica from his office, describing her as supportive and understanding, words that once described their own relationship. What struck Claire most wasn't his confession, but how he couldn't meet her eyes, as if her gaze might reflect back the magnitude of his betrayal. He spoke of paperwork, of splitting assets, of how he'd be fair with the divorce settlement, as if abandoning his terminally ill wife could ever be considered fair. Claire remained silent, not giving him the satisfaction of her tears or rage. When he finally walked out, he didn't slam the door dramatically. He closed it with careful quietness, as if trying not to disturb the life he was abandoning. Claire watched the empty door frame for nearly an hour afterward. He hadn't even looked back. The click of the door closing felt like the period at the end of a sentence she never expected to read. The house expanded around Claire in the weeks that followed. Rooms suddenly too large, silences too absolute. She'd roll to his side of the bed unconsciously in the night, only to jolt awake at the empty coolness of the sheets. Sleep became a luxury as her treatments intensified. Chemotherapy left her nauseated and exhausted, her once thick hair coming out in clumps that clogged the shower drain. Some mornings she could barely summon the strength to make herself tea, let alone manage the divorce papers that arrived by courier just 2 weeks after Robert's departure. The unsigned documents sat on the kitchen counter, a physical manifestation of his betrayal that she couldn't bring herself to touch. Friends tried to help with rides to treatment and homemade meals left on her porch, but their pity was sometimes harder to bear than the solitude. "How are you holding up?" they'd ask, voices gentle as if speaking to a child. Claire would smile and assure them she was managing, unwilling to voice the truth that sometimes the cancer seemed like the lesser of her problems. The deeper pain came from knowing that the person who had vowed to stand by her in sickness and in health had found her illness inconvenient, her suffering an obstacle to his happiness. At night, alone in their bed, Claire would stare at the ceiling and wonder which would kill her first, the cancer spreading through her body or the heartbreak that had settled in her chest like a stone. On a particularly difficult evening when the pain medication wasn't quite touching the edges of her discomfort, Claire stumbled upon an old drawer while searching for a heating pad. Inside lay a forgotten lottery ticket, purchased months ago when Robert still smiled at her, when their future still seemed unlimited. It was from their anniversary weekend getaway to the coast, a tradition they'd maintained for years. "For luck," Robert had said back then, kissing her cheek as they selected their numbers together. She almost threw it away, this relic from a life that no longer existed. But something stopped her, perhaps the memory of how hopeful they'd been that day, how certain of their shared future. Instead, she tucked it into her robe pocket, a small act of sentimentality that felt both foolish and necessary. Later that night, unable to sleep through the pain, Claire remembered the ticket. On a whim, she checked the numbers online, expecting nothing. The screen loaded slowly, her internet connection as unreliable as her ex-husband. When the winning numbers appeared, Claire stared in disbelief, checking and rechecking the sequence against her ticket. She compared the dates, sure she was hallucinating, a side effect of her medication perhaps. But the truth remained irrefutable on her screen. She had won. Not a small consolation prize, but millions. The universe had handed her a lifeline precisely when she'd been preparing to sink. Claire didn't scream or jump with excitement when she confirmed her lottery win. Instead, she sat in perfect stillness on her couch, the verified ticket trembling slightly in her hand. The irony wasn't lost on her, money arriving when she might not have enough time left to spend it. But as dawn broke outside her window, casting long shadows across her living room, something shifted inside her. A strange calm settled over her, followed by a surge of determination she hadn't felt since before her diagnosis. This wasn't just money, it was opportunity. It was choice. It was the power to determine her own path forward, without begging or compromising. First on her agenda, a specialist in Boston whose experimental treatment had shown promising results but wasn't covered by insurance. Claire had resigned herself to standard care, to accepting her prognosis with dignity. But now, possibility unfurled before her like a road suddenly cleared of obstacles. She didn't call Robert. She didn't call anyone. Instead, she lit a single candle in her dark kitchen, a small flame of celebration that was hers alone. The light flickered across her face, illuminating the first genuine smile that had crossed her lips in months. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about living, truly living, whatever time she had left. And she would do it on her own terms. The experimental treatment in Boston was brutal, worse than the standard chemotherapy she'd endured before. Claire lost the last of her hair, dropped 20 pounds from her already thin frame, and spent days so nauseated she could barely lift her head from the pillow. But unlike her previous treatments, this time she wasn't fighting alone. She'd used her new resources to rent an apartment near the medical center, hiring a private nurse for the worst days and joining a support group of patients undergoing similar protocols. For the first time since her diagnosis, Claire was surrounded by people who understood exactly what she was experiencing, the fear, the pain, the gritty determination. In their company, she didn't have to pretend to be stronger than she felt. It's okay to be angry, her nurse told her one particularly difficult morning. It's okay to curse the universe sometimes. Claire had smiled weakly. I'm saving my energy for healing, she replied. And slowly, against the odds her original doctors had given her, she began to respond to the treatment. The tumors started shrinking. Her blood work showed improvement. By the 6-month mark, her oncologist was using words like remarkable and unprecedented. Claire didn't attribute her improvement solely to the expensive treatment. She believed that finally fighting for herself rather than struggling to save a marriage that was already gone had unleashed something powerful within her, something that no amount of medical intervention could provide. As her strength returned, Claire found herself researching other patients' stories, particularly those who had been denied access to experimental treatments due to cost or location. She spent evenings on her laptop reading heartbreaking accounts of families bankrupted by medical bills, of promising treatments available only to those with resources or connections. One night, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, Claire drafted an outline of what would later become her mission statement. She didn't want her name attached to it yet. This wasn't about recognition or even gratitude. It was about addressing a systemic failure she now understood intimately. Access should not be determined by luck, she wrote. Survival should not be a luxury. In the morning, she contacted the lawyer who had helped her manage her lottery winnings. I want to start a foundation, she told him, voice steady with conviction. I want to create a pathway for patients who have been told there's nothing more we can do to access treatments that might save them. The lawyer had cautioned her about the complexity of such an endeavor, about regulations and bureaucratic hurdles. Claire simply smiled. I've beaten cancer, she reminded him. Paperwork doesn't scare me. Within weeks, the framework for what would become the Second Chance Foundation began taking shape, Claire's response to a system that had failed too many for too long. Claire maintained her anonymity as the foundation took form, preferring to work behind the scenes rather than becoming the public face of the organization. She assembled a team of medical professionals, patient advocates, and legal experts who shared her vision of democratizing access to experimental treatments. The foundation's first success came 6 months after its inception, funding a clinical trial for a mother of 3 from Detroit who had exhausted all standard treatments for her aggressive lymphoma. When the woman's cancer went into remission, Claire felt a sense of purpose that transcended anything she had experienced before. This wasn't just about extending her own life anymore, it was about creating something that would outlast her whether she survived 5 more years or 50. The foundation grew rapidly, establishing relationships with research hospitals across the country and developing a reputation for cutting through bureaucratic red tape to get patients what they needed when time was of the essence. Claire never sought the spotlight, but the media eventually caught wind of the mysterious lottery winner funding medical miracles. A local newspaper ran the headline, "Angel Investor Gives Terminal Patients Second Chance." Claire clipped the article and pinned it to her refrigerator, not out of vanity, but as a reminder of how far she had come from that kitchen table where her world had once collapsed around her. 3 years after her diagnosis, with her cancer in remission and her foundation thriving, Claire was reviewing grant applications in her home office when a news segment caught her attention. She rarely watched television these days, preferring the company of books or the satisfaction of foundation work, but something about the reporter's tone made her turn up the volume. "Breakthrough treatment offers hope for rare childhood diseases," announced the anchor before cutting to footage of a research facility that Claire recognized immediately, one of her foundation's partner institutions. She smiled, pleased to see their work gaining mainstream attention, but the smile froze on her face as the camera panned to a familiar figure being interviewed. Robert stood beside a female researcher, identified by the caption as Jessica Wright, lead researcher. His new wife. Claire sat perfectly still, absorbing the strange collision of her past and present. She hadn't seen Robert since the day he walked out, their divorce finalized through lawyers and paperwork. He looked older, more tired than she remembered. The camera moved to include a third person in the frame, a small girl, perhaps 4 years old, with Robert's eyes and Jessica's blonde hair. "Our daughter Charlotte was diagnosed 6 months ago," Robert was saying, his voice cracking with emotion. "We're hoping this research might lead to a treatment before it's too late." Claire turned off the television, hands trembling slightly. The universe had a strange sense of humor indeed. Claire couldn't shake the image of the little girl from the news segment, Robert's daughter, innocent and undeserving of whatever rare disease had befallen her. She tried to focus on other foundation matters but found herself returning to her computer, searching medical databases for information on childhood diseases currently being researched at that particular institution. It didn't take long to identify the condition. Batten disease, a rare and fatal genetic disorder that progressively damages the brain and nervous system. Most children diagnosed didn't live past their teenage years. Claire felt a complex surge of emotions, anger at Robert's betrayal still simmering beneath the surface, but also a profound sadness for the child caught in circumstances beyond her control. That evening, she found herself staring at an old photograph she kept in her desk drawer, not of Robert, but of her own father who had died when she was young. "We don't get to choose our parents," she murmured to the empty room. The next morning, Claire called a meeting with her medical advisory board. "I want to expand our pediatric program," she announced. "Specifically, I want to fund a comprehensive research initiative on Batten disease." Her team exchanged glances, aware this was outside their usual focus on adult cancers. "It's rare," her medical director noted cautiously. "Resources might be better allocated elsewhere." Claire met his gaze steadily. Sometimes the rarest diseases deserve the most attention, she replied, especially when children are involved. 6 months later, Claire was reviewing the quarterly report on the Foundation's new pediatric initiative when her assistant interrupted with an unusual message. "There's a man insisting on speaking with you," she said, looking uncomfortable. "He says it's about his daughter's application to our Batten disease trial." Claire's heart stuttered. "Did he give a name?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "Robert Caldwell," her assistant confirmed. "He says it's urgent. His daughter was rejected from the trial, but he believes she meets the criteria." Claire closed her eyes briefly, gathering herself before nodding. "Tell him I'll call back within the hour." After her assistant left, Claire pulled up the file for Charlotte Caldwell. The rejection had been procedural, not based on medical criteria but on application timing. The trial had reached its participant limit the day before their submission. Claire studied the medical records, the desperate note from Charlotte's parents describing her rapid decline, the photos of a beautiful child whose time was running out. She thought about redirecting them to another program, about maintaining her anonymity, about protecting herself from reopening old wounds. Then she picked up the phone and instructed her assistant to schedule a meeting. "Tell Mr. Caldwell I'll see him tomorrow at 2. And Sarah, don't mention my name. Just say the Foundation director will meet with him personally." Claire drove herself to the hospital where the Foundation maintained offices, taking the long route to calm her nerves. It had been nearly 5 years since she'd last seen Robert. 5 years of rebuilding her life, of creating meaning from destruction. She parked in the underground garage, checking her appearance in the rearview mirror, healthy color in her cheeks. Hair grown back fuller than before. A confidence in her eyes that had been absent during her marriage. The woman Robert had abandoned no longer existed. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who had transformed personal tragedy into purpose. Still, her hands trembled slightly as she rode the elevator to the 6th floor. She nodded to her assistant and took a deep breath before opening her office door. Robert stood by the window, his back to her, shoulders slumped with the distinctive posture of a parent carrying too much worry for too long. When he turned at the sound of the door, the recognition hit him physically. He staggered slightly, face draining of color as if he'd seen a ghost. In a way, perhaps he had. "Claire," he whispered, disbelief evident in every syllable. She didn't smile, didn't offer any warm greeting. She simply met his gaze directly for the first time in years and gestured to the chair across from her desk. "I understand you wanted to discuss your daughter's application," she said, her voice steady and professional. "Please sit down." Robert looked older than she remembered, gray threading his temples, lines etched deeply around his eyes, the markings of someone living under constant stress. He sat awkwardly, still staring at her as if unable to reconcile her presence. "I didn't know," he finally managed. "The Foundation, it's yours?" Claire nodded once, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the emotional storm brewing beneath the surface. "I founded it after my cancer went into remission," she explained simply. "Now about Charlotte. I've reviewed her file." She opened the folder on her desk, using it as a shield against the intensity of his gaze. "She seems to meet all the medical criteria for our trial. The rejection was due to timing rather than eligibility." Robert's hands were clasped so tightly his knuckles had turned white. "Can you help her?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Please, Claire. She's only 4. We've tried everything else." Claire looked up from the file to study the face of the man who had walked out when she needed him most. The face of someone now understanding what it meant to watch someone you love suffer without recourse. She didn't feel the vindication she might once have expected. Instead, she felt the weight of power, not power to hurt, but power to heal. Without a word, She signed the approval form at the bottom of Charlotte's file. "She'll start treatment next week," Claire said quietly, sliding the paper across the desk. "I'll make sure of it." Claire watched Robert's expression transform as he processed her decision, disbelief giving way to hope, then crumbling into something raw and vulnerable. Tears filled his eyes, something she'd rarely seen during their years together. "I don't understand," he whispered. "After what I did to you, how can you help us?" Claire considered her response carefully. This moment wasn't about forgiveness or revenge. It was about the kind of person she had chosen to become. "This isn't about you, Robert," she said finally, her voice gentle but firm. "This has never been about you. Your daughter is innocent in all this. She deserves every chance at life, regardless of our history." Robert covered his face with his hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Claire remained seated behind her desk, maintaining the necessary distance, both physical and emotional. After a moment, he composed himself enough to speak again. "Jessica doesn't know," he admitted, "about how I left you. She thinks we were already separated when you got sick." Claire wasn't surprised. She had suspected as much. People rarely cast themselves as villains in their own stories. "That's between you and your wife," she replied. "My concern is Charlotte and making sure she gets the treatment she needs." As Robert stood to leave, visibly overwhelmed, he paused at the door. "Thank you," he said, the words clearly insufficient but all he had to offer. Claire simply nodded. "The foundation will be in touch with next steps." Once alone, she turned to the window, watching rain begin to fall outside. There was no satisfaction in his gratitude, but there was peace in knowing she had remained true to herself. The waiting room of the pediatric wing felt impossibly small when Claire arrived for Charlotte's first day of treatment. She hadn't planned to be there, had intended to maintain professional distance, but something pulled her to the hospital that morning. Perhaps it was closure, or perhaps it was simple human concern for a child's suffering. She spotted Robert immediately, pacing nervously by the window while a blonde woman, Jessica, sat clutching a small backpack decorated with unicorns. Between them on a plastic chair sat Charlotte, thin and pale but still managing to flip through a picture book with interest. Claire hung back, observing the family from a distance. When a nurse called Charlotte's name, she watched as Jessica lifted the girl, whispering reassurances into her ear. Robert followed them toward the treatment room, but paused when he spotted Claire. He approached hesitantly, leaving his wife and daughter to continue with the nurse. "You didn't have to come," he said, uncertainty in his voice. Claire straightened her shoulders. "I like to check in on our program participants," she replied, professional and detached. "Especially the first sessions." Robert shifted uncomfortably, clearly wanting to say more but struggling to find the words. Claire saved him the effort. "This isn't about you," she repeated, the phrase becoming something of a mantra. "I hope the treatment helps Charlotte." She turned to leave, but Robert's voice stopped her. "I'm sorry," he blurted, the words rushing out as if he'd been holding them back for years. "For everything. For being a coward when you needed me most." Claire raised her hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "I'm not interested in your apology," she said quietly. "Direct that energy toward your daughter. She needs you now." Walking away, Claire felt lighter than she had in years, the burden of their shared history finally beginning to lift. Charlotte's response to the experimental treatment surpassed everyone's expectations. Within 3 months, her neurological decline had not only halted but showed signs of reversal. Claire monitored her progress through clinical reports, maintaining professional distance while ensuring the little girl received every possible advantage the foundation could provide. She deliberately scheduled her hospital visits for times when she knew the family wouldn't be there, not wanting to complicate Charlotte's treatment with the emotional baggage of adult relationships. But fate had other plans. 6 months into Charlotte's treatment, Claire arrived for a routine program evaluation to find the child alone in the playroom, building an elaborate tower of blocks while a nurse supervised from nearby. Claire tried to retreat unnoticed, but Charlotte looked up with the uncanny awareness children sometimes possess. "Are you the angel lady?" she asked, her voice clear and strong, a dramatic improvement from the slurred speech documented in her early medical reports. Claire froze, confused by the question. "My daddy says an angel lady made me better," Charlotte explained, returning to her blocks. "He cries sometimes when he talks about her." The nurse shot Claire an apologetic look, clearly unaware of the connection. Claire hesitated, then moved to sit across from Charlotte. "I'm just someone who wants to help children like you get better," she said gently. Charlotte nodded seriously. "That's what angels do," she replied with the simple logic of childhood. Claire watched her play for a while longer, marveling at the steady hands that had once trembled uncontrollably, at the bright eyes that were regaining their focus. Whatever complicated emotions existed between herself and Robert, this outcome, this child's second chance, made everything worthwhile. A letter arrived at Claire's home address nearly a year after Charlotte began treatment. The handwriting on the envelope was familiar. She had once watched it sign birthday cards and grocery lists and eventually divorce papers. She considered throwing it away unopened. Her life had moved forward in remarkable ways. The foundation was thriving, her cancer remained in remission, and she had even begun dating again, a kind oncologist who understood her history and approached their relationship with gentle patience. There was no place in this new life for reopening old wounds. And yet curiosity prevailed. Inside was a single page, not filled with excuses or pleas for forgiveness as she might have expected, but with raw, unvarnished truth. Robert wrote of his shame, his regret, and his gratitude, not asking for reconciliation but simply acknowledging the debt he could never repay. Charlotte will grow up knowing that true strength isn't about who stands by you when things are easy, he wrote. It's about who finds the courage to help others, even when they have every reason not to. Claire read the letter once, absorbing each word, then took it to her fireplace. She didn't need Robert's confessions or praise to validate the person she had become. She watched the paper curl and blacken, the ashes floating upward like released burdens. Through her window, stars were beginning to appear in the evening sky, the same stars that had witnessed her at her lowest point years ago, now shining on a woman transformed by both suffering and triumph. She didn't need Robert's acknowledgement of her strength. She had proven it to herself, and that was enough. 5 years to the day from her original diagnosis, Claire stood at a podium addressing attendees at her foundation's annual gala. The ballroom glittered with lights and possibility, filled with donors, medical professionals, and most importantly, treatment recipients and their families. Claire rarely made public appearances, preferring to work behind the scenes, but this anniversary felt significant enough to break her rule. "We don't just treat illness," she told the hushed crowd. "We treat abandonment. We stand in the gap for those who have been told there's nothing more to be done, for those who feel that hope has left the room." From her vantage point on stage, she could see faces illuminated with emotion, including, in the back corner, Robert and Jessica with a healthy Charlotte between them. Claire hadn't invited them, someone on her staff must have added them to the guest list. Their presence didn't disturb her peace. If anything, it completed the circle, offering tangible proof of her journey from victim to savior, from abandoned to empowered. "Every person in this room has a before and after story," she continued, her voice strong and clear. "Mine began in a kitchen with a cancer diagnosis and ended here, with all of you, with the recognition that our greatest power lies not in what happens to us, but in how we transform it. The applause was thunderous as she left the stage, moving through the crowd that parted respectfully before her. She didn't stop to speak with Robert's family. There was no need. Their chapter had closed. Claire walked out into the cool evening air, her foundation secure, her future open, her heart finally completely her own. If you enjoyed this story about strength, resilience, and forgiveness in the face of betrayal, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more emotional and thought-provoking content. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder about the power of rising above life's challenges. What would you have done in Claire's position? Would you have helped your ex's child? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.